Go. All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday. Ooh.
There's a party today.
There's a party?
Yeah, I think it's 3 to 6.
Where's my invitation? Maybe it's in my junk folder here. Or not.
They get so many invitations, they always go to the junk part.
I know. Oh, no. They go to a bin, right? I have like a whole bin for like party invitations, and I just can't get to them all. So they just.
That's the downside of popularity.
I know, right? I'm so popular that yeah. Well, another party invitation. Throw it in the bin.
Check you later.
Yeah. Just tell my butler. Throw it in the bin. I'll look at it.
$1,000?
Yeah. Ugh. Yeah. Yeah. Unless it's Jay-Z or Beyonce, don't bother me. Okay. Here we go. Let's get started. So Rose is here. Good morning, Rose. Ananda's here. Good morning, Ananda. Ty is here. Good morning, Ty. John's here. Good morning, John. Helen's here. Hi, Helen. Shania's here. Good morning. Kevin's here. Good morning, Kevin. And Ashley's here. Good morning, Ashley. Are we okay? Okay. Right. Let's jump back into the Russian Federation, a country and a people that have a special place in my heart. I do like the Russians. As you'll discover very shortly, I'm not a big fan of Vladimir Putin, but I do like the Russian people. So we were talking yesterday about the end of the Soviet Union, and we said that when we head into 1991 in the Soviet Union, things are pretty bad, right? The economy is in such a state that there are food shortages and product shortages. There's inflation, so the currency has been devalued and the prices have kind of gone up. Most people can't afford to buy the things that they need to buy, the basic foodstuffs that they need to buy, never mind some of the fancier stuff that is finding its way into the market. And again, there's a power struggle between the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, or the Russian Republic, as we should say, and Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union. And so there's an attempted coup at one point in 1991 where some Communist Party officials say, enough is enough. These reforms are tearing the country apart. We need to take back control. And they roll into Moscow with 8 tanks. But again, we saw in the video that they had a very poorly planned coup, didn't really involve all of the military. We saw some interviews with Communist Party officials, and they were kind of hapless in terms of what had gone wrong. But again, poorly planned, poorly executed. It doesn't really work. And again, fortunately for probably the Russian people, but also for Boris Yeltsin, he manages to get back in time to Moscow. He gets to the parliament buildings, he's up on the tanks, rallying the people to fight for their democracy, and it's a huge moment for him, right? People see it on television. Awesome. That's what you want, right? As a politician, you don't get a lot of moments like that, right? You don't get a lot of, moments that everyone's like, oh, right? And the people remember you by. And again, maybe last week we saw it in the Cold War video. Remember when Ronald Reagan was giving that speech in front of the Berlin Wall, and he's like, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall? Big moment, right? Like goosebump moment. And so not many politicians get one of those. Certainly Donald Trump has not had any of those. For Obama, I almost think it might have been, it wasn't his inauguration speech, but I think it was the speech he gave when he won the Democratic Party nomination. And he had this great speech, and it was his yes we can speech, yes we can. And it was a big moment for Obama. And so politicians don't get a lot of big moments like this. If you're lucky, you get one. And Boris Yeltsin has his right here, and he gets up on the tank and looks like a hero, and it's going to pay off for him, right? Gorbachev, unfortunately, is under arrest, and so there's not much he can do, right? But they mentioned in the documentary, even when he was released, he should have he should have gone to the parliament and said, you know, Boris Yeltsin was here fighting for democracy. Awesome. And then he can kind of attach himself to that moment, right? And make it look like there's a united front, right? But he didn't go. I don't know why, but he kind of missed his opportunity politically. And so either way, big moment for Boris Yeltsin, failed coup attempt. But the sort of writing was on the wall, if you will, for the Soviet Union. And while Boris Yeltsin and Gorbachev were working out a new power sharing agreement, secretly, behind the scenes, Boris Yeltsin was working to, he had plans of his own, right? And so as it turns out, he and the presidents of Belarus and Ukraine, they get together and they sign themselves into a union of the Commonwealth of Independent States, right? And a lot of other Soviet socialist republics have already left the union at this point. And so these last three leave, and for Gorbachev, he's kind of screwed, right? Because he's now president of a union of Soviet socialist republics that has no republics in it. So he's got an empty container to be president of. And so again, on Christmas Day, we see him step down as leader of the Soviet Union. And we saw that right at the beginning of the video, right? Remember when he was on television, and he said, you know, this isn't what I wanted. This isn't the way I wanted things to go, but I'm forced to resign, right? And well, duh. Yeah, well, duh. What else could he have done, right? Yeah, I know. President of nothing is not really a title you can have. Well, you can, but who wants to? But yeah, you're right. I mean, what else could he do? He was outmaneuvered, or the forces he set in motion, you know, kind of got totally out of his control to the point where, you know, they destroyed the entire country in a way. At least on paper they did. And so, yeah, there was nothing left for him to do, really, right? So yeah, that's all he could do. And again, it's kind of on a bit of a personal note, it's kind of sad for him, right? Because he did want to save the Soviet Union. He did want to make the Soviet Union great. I was going to say again, but it wasn't ever actually that great. He did want to make it great. He did want to fix the problems, and you know, unfortunately, you know, everything he did sort of blew up in his face all the way along. It's probably led to a better outcome, hopefully a better outcome for the Russians, but it still remains to be seen. Certainly their quality of life now is a little bit better than in Soviet times. Actually, it's undoubtedly better, but I think it still lags behind a lot of the G7 or G8 countries. And again, they have, well, we'll get to that, but Russia still has major problems with corruption and organized crime, and a democracy that is questionable in its democraticness, right? So they still have a lot of issues. Russia does. It's better than it was in Soviet times, and it's certainly better than it was after this switch happens. Because again, in Soviet times, at the end of the Soviet Union, the economy is not that great. There's a lot of chaos and uncertainty. And once we transition into the Russian Republic, the same things are there, right? So I think a lot of Russians maybe naively thought that, oh, once we get rid of this communism stuff, everything will be better, right? And there's probably a grain of truth to that. But the reality is that capitalist economies work because there's a lot of regulations in place, and people kind of know how to do them, right? People kind of know how to run companies. People know how to, for some reason, I'm just gonna switch my wireless. Okay, hopefully that's working again. Right. Very few people have experience with democracy. Very few people have experience with capitalism. And again, nobody really knows how to do it, and there are no regulations to ensure that capitalism doesn't go off the rails. Because it can, right? It can very quickly get out of control. look at the Great Depression, right? So that was a case where the market really got out of control, and that was a market that was to some degree regulated, and it was in a country where people had a lot of experience with capitalism and market capitalism. But here, nobody has any experience with it, and there's no regulations, and so things could really go any way. And unfortunately, initially they go down is where they go, or sideways if you.
Think about the Soviet Union.
Yes.
We know how it fell apart. We know how did Russia become communist, but we don't know how they become USSR. Like all those little republics here and there.
Oh, I think they are. I think they are absorbed into the Soviet Union, probably under military force. But you're right. That's something that we haven't discussed: is how all of those republics come to belong to the Soviet Union. And I think they're just basically annexed under Stalin. And at that time, the Soviet Union is powerful enough to simply take control of places like Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan that are kind of non-industrialized, poor, kind of simple countries, right? And it's very easy for the Red Army to just roll in and say, okay, you're ours now. And I think you can see that the Soviet Union kind of strategically takes countries to make sure that they are protected, right? And so anywhere, around the Caspian Sea here and around the Black Sea, they've expanded. Yeah, they've expanded all the way, onto China. They had strong control over Mongolia, even though Mongolia wasn't a republic, but the Soviets had their hooks into Mongolia as well. And so they kind of expanded as far as they could in order to kind of secure their borders. And I think most of that happened under Stalin. And again, it's not something we talked about, but I assume because you're dealing with a powerful industrial country like the Soviet Union, and then lots of other countries that weren't really powerful or industrialized, and I think there was probably not much of a fight. They're just like, yep, you're ours now.
Why did they take out Turkey to complete the surround the Black Sea that they found wrong to get access to Turkey?
Well, I think that had to do with how we came out of the Second World War and the sort of agreements at Potsdam and Tehran and Moscow, where they agreed on spheres of influence.
Yeah, but these countries were captured before the Second World War. Like the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic was there before the Second World War.
Oh, that's true. That's true. I'm not sure why they didn't wind up finding their way into Turkey. I think it's because what happens before Ataturk?
Because, before Ataturk,
It's the Ottomans.
Like between the Ottomans and Ataturk, the British were there.
Maybe it had to do with a kind of a strong British presence prior to.
Maybe, but I know that with us, that part which is now Azerbaijan and Armenia,
Yep.
we lost it to them.
To Soviet,
To the Russians.
to the Russians, yeah.
But they weren't exactly USSR.
Yeah, that's actually a good series of questions, and the short answer is I'm not entirely sure. And again, I think it probably had to do with who was already there, like whether the. What's that?
The weak and pathetic dynasty was in power.
Oh. And so yeah, and so yeah, I don't know. I think is the short answer to that. But I assume most of those republics were absorbed in without too much drama, or at least on a global scale anyway. But the other thing is that again, there's probably each republic will have its own story, right, of how they became part of the Soviet Union, and was there a resistance or was there not, or were there Western countries there before, or what? Each republic is going to have its own story of what happened to it. Yeah. Let me see. Okay, we said that after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was some pressing questions, right? One of which was who was going to occupy their seat on the Security Council in the UN. There was the very pressing question of nuclear weapons, right? We said there were tens of thousands of nuclear weapons live and in operation in the Soviet Union. And again, where are they all, right? So, you know, imagine you've got Soviet nuclear weapons, but now you've got 14 different countries that are autonomous and doing whatever they want. And so again, what do they want? What are they going to do with their nuclear technology? Well, who knows, right? So again, it became very important to figure out where those weapons were and to kind of repatriate them to the Russian Federation, which they wound up doing. What's that? I used a fancy word, repatriated them. So they brought them back. They gave them back to the Russian Federation. We said that there were some ethnic conflicts in former republics, and so lots of those republics were a different cultural or ethnic group that the Russians had kind of taken over and imposed their culture and language and way of doing things. And once the Soviet Union was finished, those republics said, hey, we don't want Russian, we don't want Russian people in power, get out, right? So there was a little bit of struggle in that regard. And again, the big question of what was the former Soviet Union, or what was the Russian Republic going to become at this point? Because it was a very open question. It was a communist, effectively dictatorship, where some elements of democracy were being added in, and then it was, you know, the whole thing disintegrated. And so what's it going to be now?
You read there that START is signed and nuclear material is transferred from Congress to Russia or the US.
START was earlier though, wasn't it? Is that the error, or what are you saying?
Or US.
I think so. I think the US took control of some of it as well.
Wow, those greedy people.
Well, I think they took control of it in order to decommission it, I think is what it was.
Yeah.
You don't buy that?
No, the only thing they would do is just like change take the warhead, dump the rest of the ICBM and just put it in the
It's possible. Although, in their defense, they really had enough already anyway.
But they're greedy.
Maybe. Of course, the Cold War is over, though. You don't need all those nuclear weapons. I'll show that to you later. Okay, so yesterday I asked you to read this, and we said that there were some political and economic problems. Actually, we didn't answer these questions. Okay, can you open your books and we'll talk about this? So I'll answer this one because it's already on the screen. 323 to 326, and then the questions are on 327 or something like that, I think. So political and economic problems in Russia. So this is right after the fall of the Soviet Union. Again, democracy is slow to develop. People don't have a lot of experience with democracy, and again, there's no structure, right? So this is the problem with going. This is always the danger, I think, in a country that's in transition, is that if you have an existing constitution maybe, or you have an existing way of governing your country, and you need to move to something else. And it's a very precarious transition, and it's a difficult transition. But oftentimes, and in the case in the Soviet Union, you have to have something to go to, right? You have to have a plan for governance. And I don't think that that's entirely in place in Russia. They don't know what they're going to. And so I think they kind of just take the Congress of People's Deputies and the party system and they just continue it. But, there's no constitution, right? And so there's no document that very clearly lays out who has what powers and who can and can't do what, right? That's what you want the Constitution for, is to define what the powers of the government are and how they work. But if you don't have a constitution, then everything is up for grabs, right? Can Boris Yeltsin make this decision? Who knows, right? Normally you would go to the Constitution and say, can the president make this decision, yes or no? But with no clear constitution, it's kind of up to general agreement whether he can or not, or whether he's simply influential enough to get his way. And again, that's a little bit chaotic, right? You need a clear set of rules for running a country, and here in Russia it doesn't exist. And as an analogy, I think I said in this class that I like to imagine a constitution like the rules for like a board game. You know, every board game has a set of rules, right? And so, you know, if you're, you know, going around the board and rolling your dice and picking cards and buying hotels or whatever you're doing, if you get confused, you can always go to the rule book and say, oh, is Eliana allowed to do that? Is she allowed to buy this house now or buy this hotel? And you can check it out. But if you don't have the rule book, then what, right? Then everyone's like, oh, okay, what do we do? Is she allowed to do that, guys? Okay, I guess she's allowed to do that. Okay, let's do it. But you're never really sure if you should allow her to do it or not, and you're not really sure if it's going to screw the whole game up, right? And so if you don't know the rules, you can kind of make it up as you go, but there's a good chance the game is going to start to, it's going to take a side turn. It's going to start to fall apart if you don't know how to play it. And that's kind of exactly what's going to happen to Russia. They're trying to play a game that they don't have rules for. And not only that, they haven't really played this type of game before. And so it's going to be treacherous for them. Again, the Russians had maybe an unrealistic expectations that things would get really better, right? Once they got rid of communism, their quality of life would go up, their satisfaction would go up, everything would be great. And again, that wasn't the case. Things actually got worse before they got better, unfortunately. And the other thing we see is that there are, in many ways, there's no rules for the economy, okay? There's no regulations, there's no, again, capitalist economies have a lot of rules and regulations and licenses, and you would be shocked to run this college how much work goes on behind the scenes just to make sure that we're actually running the business properly. To ensure that, so we have to be accredited by the Ministry of Advanced Education for our university program, by the Ministry of Education for our high school program. We have the Canada Revenue Agency who checks all our taxes. We have an audit every year because we're supposed to have one. We have mountains and mountains of paperwork that keeps track of all of our financial transactions. We have people checking them over, making sure that we're not losing any money here or there, or, you know, everything is above board and, you know, being done correctly, which it is, by the way. There's a massive amount of work that goes into it, and there's a massive amount of rules that we have to follow as a business and as a academic institution. But again, those rules take time to be created, for the government to create them. And here, they don't really exist. And so people are doing all kinds of crazy things, buying and selling and on an unregulated market. Some people are going bankrupt, some people are making wild amounts of money, and it's chaotic. It's super chaotic.
Wait, what did you mean by monopoly?
What's a monopoly?
Is it the like small business that are run by two people or something like that?
Kind of.
Monopoly?
Hmm.
It's like you have the privilege to be the only person who can do or have something.
Yeah, monopoly. Yeah, a monopoly occurs where there's only one provider for a given service, and that's usually bad because there's no one for them to compete with, and so they can just do whatever they want and charge whatever they want. And if people want that service, they'll have to buy it. And again, it's super bad if it happens to be something that people actually need. You definitely don't want a monopoly on something that people critically, yeah.
There's a monopoly on that.
What's that?
There's a monopoly on electricity.
There is one
Isn't there?
here in BC?
Yeah, they just won't provide it.
There's two depending on where you are, but I think they operate under government regulation, or they're kind of an arm of the government. And so the government is in the business of trying to provide people with competitive electrical rates. So sometimes that happens, and I think particularly in BC, there's a lot of corporations that are closely tied to the government in the interest of trying to provide competitive prices. But in the case of like mobile and wireless services, we have lots of different companies, and that's good, even though our wireless rates are still too high, unless you go with Fido or Freedom or something like that.
So,
Yeah.
So when you say monopoly, that's like regulation. So like they didn't have rules for the monopoly.
Often what happened is that everything was so centralized in the Soviet Union. Everything was so centralized that the government owned it all, right? And so this is what we'll talk about shortly. Is the question is, in a communist system, all businesses are owned by the state. All businesses and all resources are the government. In a capitalist system, almost everything is owned by private citizens, right? Sometimes there's a few government-owned businesses, like in Canada, Canada Post, owned by the government, owned and operated. This is a capitalist, yeah, this is a market economy that we have, but we have some things that are owned by the government. And so, yeah, Canada Post is a perfect example. It's a company owned by the government, but everything else is owned by just individual people. But the question is, how do you get between them? How do you take all of this stuff that the state owns and transfer it to the people? How do you give these businesses to business owners? How do you get from one to the other? And that's the tricky part, is because initially there are monopolies because the state owns everything. And so how do you break everything up and distribute it to the people, right? So if you have one electricity company, right, the state electricity company, how do you break it up and get it into the hands of private business owners so that they can compete with each other and hopefully give consumers the lowest price? How do you do that?
talking about the college,
Yeah.
you said that you hold something every year.
Hold something? We hold meetings 3 times a year. So
Meetings, you use the term all or something.
what did I say?
It started like all.
Oh.
I don't know.
Uh,
And that you said you held once a year because you had to.
oh, no, we have society meetings 3 times a year because we're a democratic society. That's what runs this place. Not a single owner, but a charitable society. And so we have to meet 3 times a year. Technically, I think by law we have to meet once, but by our bylaws we have to meet 3 times a year. And so at the end of October is when we last met. And so big things get decided at these meetings. Little things we have other ways of deciding, but the big things get decided at the meeting. Okay, so Yeltsin tries to sort of go down this path of reform, right? So he's got a communist country with a socialist economy with little bits of democracy sprinkled in, and he's got to somehow move it to a market economy. And again, it's not an easy process. And as he tries to do it, he faces more and more opposition, right? So there's people who are criticizing him strongly. There are people who are trying to impeach him. So you'll remember Donald Trump was impeached, but nothing happened to him. But there was talk of impeaching Boris Yeltsin because people weren't happy with the effects of the reforms. There was an attempted coup again. There was a second attempted coup in which, as you can see, people were killed and wounded. So this was a more serious and almost more successful coup by communists. And after that, Yeltsin starts to rule by authoritarian decree. So no democracy, just whatever Yeltsin says, that's what we're doing, right? Because again, things were getting a little out of control, according to Yeltsin, I guess, and he starts to rule basically as a dictator for a short period of time. So he's a dictator until the next period of elections. The other thing that was going on here is that many people who were in the government and in the parliament were elected during communist times. And so lots of them are still kind of thinking in a communist kind of way, right? So again, they're trying to move to a new system, but so many of the people in the government are firmly anchored in the old system. And so they have trouble kind of making decisions that will get them closer to a market economy and a democracy because the only thing they have experience with is a communist dictatorship, right? again, their constitution is outdated. I think the constitution they were going with was the one from 1978, but that was the one for the Soviet Union. Now they're playing an entirely different game, right? Try to play Monopoly with the rules from a different board game, right? It's not going to work. Yeah, it's not going to work very well, right? So again, they have lots of constitutional crises and issues because, again, the Constitution doesn't work, right? And so how do you know what Boris Yeltsin is and is not allowed to do when your rules are out of date, right? Difficult. And again, people are allowed to vote. This is a democratic system to some degree, but people aren't really quite sure what's going on, right? Everything is a little bit chaotic. So again, when Yeltsin kind of takes power here, there's the Republic of Russia becomes a constitutional republic. And again, everyone is very excited now because they've finally thrown off communism and they can maybe have a chance at a better quality of life, right? The kind of quality of life that they see in the West. But again, that's not going to materialize for them right away. It's going to take some time. But again, the Russians are impatient. They've been suffering under communism for quite some time, and they want their democracy and prosperity now, right? And it's not going to come now. It's going to come maybe a little bit later. So yeah, these early years of the Russian Federation, the early 1990s, there was a lot of hope, right? There was a lot of excitement initially, but then people were disappointed because, again, things didn't change nearly as fast as they were hoping. Sorry, I'm just going to... Yeah, so his... Yeltsin's kind of approach to switching the economy was, he kind of called it shock therapy, okay? Do you know what shock therapy is? Well, you can probably imagine what it is.
Wait, is it the one with the electricity at the head?
And they kind of zap you. This is what people used to do, you know, decades ago to treat psychiatric illnesses. They would give you electric shocks with the idea that this would somehow help cure you or something.
Probably
He's
new
saying
age.
something that shocked the whole public.
Well, what's that? They were people were shocked, I think, but again, his reforms here are known as shock therapy. And so what he does is he basically just takes his hands off the wheel, right? So in a communist country, the economy is centrally planned, right? The government organizes everything. It tells factories what to produce and how much. If the factories need more money because they're not very profitable, the government gives them money so they can pay their workers. Everything is kind of controlled and supported by the government. And what Yeltsin does is he says, that's all done, right? There's no more subsidies, there's no more planning, we're not doing anything, you're on your own, right? And again, I don't know what the right way to do this is because nobody's ever done it before, but it's pretty brutal because, again, nobody's really sure how to do this capitalism thing, and without the support of the government, people are not equipped and companies are not equipped to handle it. And so it's a bit of a short-term disaster, right? So lots of businesses are kind of unproductive. They're going out of business. They can't afford to pay their people. People are unemployed. And at the same time, Yeltsin is raising interest rates so people can't easily borrow money. He's increasing taxes. And he's cutting the welfare. He's cutting the state welfare back as well. And so, again, this is very difficult too because there are people living in the Soviet Union who have had the government supporting them their entire lives, right? And now that support is gone, right? And like, what do you do? And that's a question of what do you do anyway, but what do you do when you have no experience with any other system, right? So it's hugely stressful and it's hugely stressful and shocking, I guess, to lots of Russians, because things change really quickly and they're very chaotic, and nobody really knows where it's going, right? It's,
Like he was driving a car. He was a steering.
in some ways, well, yeah. Certainly the amount of control under the Soviet Union was complete or near complete, and now he's stepping back. And again, in a capitalist economy, that is what the government does. The government, it stays out of the economy to a significant degree, but here people have there's no warning, right? There's no warning, there's no preparation, there's no experience, and businesses are struggling just to figure out how to do this.
I wonder what he was thinking.
Well, I think he was thinking that the quicker the better, right? Don't drag it out, just make the changes, and the quicker we get this done, the quicker we can move on to prosperity, right? Let's not drag it out. We've been fighting for this for so long. Let's just do this. People will figure it out, right? Which, to some degree, there's probably some logic there, but economies are complicated, right? Economies are complicated. There's kind of a lot of information here, but what I want to point out to you is how difficult it was for Russians, right? So lots of industries are being shut down. There's an economic depression. There's high unemployment. Look at this. Throughout the 90s, Russia's GDP fell by 50%. Wow. Yeah, that's brutal. So usually what your government wants, so GDP is your gross domestic product, right? So that's all of the goods and services produced in your country for an entire year added up, right? And sometimes they divide it out by your population. So sometimes you have a GDP per capita, per person. And so usually what governments want is they want small, steady growth, right? You don't want an economy that goes up and down. That's very frightening and upsetting for everyone. You want an economy that just slowly grows every year, maybe by 1% or 2%, right? If your economy is growing by 1% or 2% every year, awesome. You're nailing it. You're doing it right. So imagine, so people in the West here, we get upset when our GDP declines, even if it gets close to 0, or even if it were to shrink, people get freaked out. So imagine what happens when your GDP falls by 50%. Unbelievable, right? Again, there's hyperinflation and a devaluation of the currency. At one point in the 90s, the Russian government chops 2 zeros off the ruble. And so 1,000 rubles becomes 10. So people's savings are wiped out. Huge numbers of people are in poverty. It's a bit of a mess, right? But there are some people who manage to come out of this ahead, okay? And this sort of unregulated Wild West period of the economy, again, forces huge numbers of Russians into poverty, but some manage to make themselves ridiculously rich in the process, okay? And so, Aliana, we were talking earlier about this idea that how do you get state-owned businesses into the hands of private citizens? Because that's what you need in a market economy, but how do you do it? And so Yeltsin decided, okay, here's what we're going to do. The government's going to print up basically coupons, okay? The government's going to print out coupons, vouchers. And so they're going to send to all Russian citizens, they're going to send you a little coupon for 10,000 rubles. And what you can do with this 10,000 rubles is not buy food or clothing or anything like that. That's the currency. Rubles are the currency, yeah. So the 10,000 rubles, you can take it and you can invest it in business. So you can buy a share or shares in companies, right? And then once those companies turn a profit, then maybe you can sell your shares and get your money, or maybe you can make money or whatever, right? So the government's giving you a coupon, and that coupon will buy you 10,000 rubles of shares in a company that the government is trying to turn over to the people, right? And so that to some degree that makes sense, right? Because if everybody buys shares in the hydro company or the electric company, then the public owns it, right? And then the government doesn't own it anymore. And so the government has gotten rid of it. It's in the hands of private citizens. Mission accomplished, right? They did it. But unfortunately, there's an issue here, and the issues are these. Number one, the Russians don't have any experience with investing in companies or in playing the stock market or anything like that. They never had a stock market. They don't know how this stuff works. The other thing is that huge numbers of people have been forced into poverty, and so when they get this 10,000 ruble check in the mail or coupon in the mail, but all they can do is buy a share in a company, they're like, what good does that do me? Like, I can't eat. I don't have any bread on my table, and you're sending me this $10,000 thing that I can't do anything with. Right? And so what do? It's worthless to them, right? It's pointless and it's upsetting. But there are some people who do have some cash in this period who say, you know what? I'll give you 1,000 rubles cash for that 10,000 ruble coupon that's useless. Interested? And lots of people are interested, right?
So the $10,000 ruble coupon.
Yeah.
Couldn't they just like take it to a bank or something and give the cash?
No.
Or they had to like
They
put
ha-
that thing-
They had to buy stock with it. They had to invest it. They couldn't just get money for it. Well, that was the thing, right? It wasn't a way of, getting cash to the public.
Didn't really understand.
No, they didn't really understand it, and it wasn't really what they desperately needed. They desperately needed the cash, right? But again, the government was trying to get them to invest in businesses in order to transfer things from the state to private hands. And so in some ways it's a decent plan, but it didn't work. And so again, some people started to buy up all of these things, right? And so lots of people said, yeah, I'll take that 1,000 rubles for this 10,000 ruble voucher that I can't do anything with. Yeah, I'll take the 1,000 rubles because I'm broke. I need the money. I'll take it. Lots of people do this. And so some people start to collect all of these vouchers. And in the process, they start to be able to buy huge chunks of industries and companies. And so as a result, again, some people gain they have huge controlling sections of companies. In 96 here, Yeltsin does another thing where he offers stock shares in exchange for bank loans. And so basically that you're loaning the government money. So you loan the government money and they give you a section of a state enterprise. And so in the process of both of these things happening, a small collection of men, probably about 12 or 13, come to own huge industries, right? Oil industries, electronics, telecommunications, energy, heavy manufacturing. A small group of guys own all of this stuff. And they start to become known as the oligarchs. And so, again, there's a handful of them in Russia. They are wildly wealthy. They were wildly wealthy in the 90s and still are for the most part. And they come to their riches through this period of kind of deregulation and their ability to access shares and sort of play ball with the government to get their hands on this stuff. And now, again, if you look at the list of, the 20 or 30 wealthiest people in the world, you'll see these guys. They've got billions and billions of dollars. They are ridiculously wealthy. What's that? Well, I'm not sure how they rate in terms of Bill Gates, but they're Bill Gates level. But the other thing is that they are immensely powerful in Russia because they hold huge sections of Russian industry, right? And so if you want to, you have a lot of power to sort of push the government. And so whatever government is in existence has to play ball with the oligarchs because they're so wealthy and so powerful and they control so much of Russia's economy and industry. So these guys kind of come out of that period. And so even though huge numbers of Russians are put into poverty, there's a handful that just get unbelievably rich, to the point where I can barely imagine how much money they have. So in 96, by the time we get to 96, Yeltsin's reputation is declining, okay? And the other thing that's happening for him is that he's actually developed a bit of a drinking problem. And he is, which is actually, in some ways it's funny, but actually in some ways it's really not. Like, I think the pressure of this changeover is incredibly stressful for him, and he drinks to soothe his anxiety. And so I'm not going to show it, but if you Google or if you go onto YouTube and search for drunk Boris Yeltsin, you'll find all kinds of videos that are a little bit funny, but also really sad and embarrassing, because he's at official functions like parades and things like that, and he is just blitzed. Like, he can barely stand up. Like, people are standing around him making sure he doesn't fall over.
You never see Stalin there.
What's that?
You never see Stalin.
No. But yeah, so anyway, but regardless, he develops a pretty heavy drinking problem. He's got health problems that are connected to that drinking. And so by the time we get into 1988, 1989, he's pretty much done, right? His prestige and his power has declined. He's facing all kinds of corruption investigations and sort of mishandling of money. The public is still unhappy because the economy hasn't produced what they wanted it to produce. And he's kind of in trouble, right? And so finally, on December 31st of 1999, he is going to step down, right? And he says this. Say again?
Roman Abramovich, the last slide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know who he is?
Yeah.
Who is he?
He's asking.
Who is he?
Yeah.
Abramovich. Those are a couple of the oligarchs. So the guys with that got super rich. These are some of them. So Boris Berezovsky, Vladimir Gusinsky, Roman Abramovich, Mikhail Khodorkovsky is another one. There's about 12 or 13 of them. And again, they're all super rich, super powerful, and they remain that way.
Roman Abramovich is still alive, yeah?
Yeah, I think so. I think they're all still alive.
Yeah, I think I know Roman Abramovich.
Are you friends with them? You've heard of him before?
He's the owner of a club.
He's the owner of a club?
Yeah.
Which club?
Chelsea.
Which one?
Chelsea.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Could be. He's
Oh, okay,
he's
that's why.
yeah.
Is he the soccer club or Chelsea's?
He's the yeah, he's the owner. He's the owner of a lot of things. He's the owner of a lot of things. But yeah, so yeah, that's where his money comes from. His money comes from this early period of Russian Federation, and the fact that he gets control of a lot of industry. I'm not sure what these guys own. I know we'll hear about Mikhail Khodorkovsky in the documentary we're going to watch. Khodorkovsky was he gained control of a massive oil company called Yukos Oil, and so he became very, very wealthy until he criticized Vladimir Putin. And we'll see what happens to him. But yeah, all of these guys are super rich, and yeah, that's probably just one of the huge number of things they own. So much money.
So just how come then Putin managed to like kick the heck out of these oligarchs because it's Putin?
He doesn't kick the heck out of them. He cooperates with them. So there's a bit of a balance between the two, right? But we'll see some of that in the documentary, how he manages to maneuver himself. But they rely on him just as much as he relies on them. Yeah, it's a I'll scratch my back, I'll scratch my back. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That's what it is.
Wait, I have a question.
Yes.
You say you were talking about the state giving people to the money and then buying small businesses. What
Yes.
happened then?
What happened? Well, some people invested, but lots of other people sold off their coupons for money. And so the people who were buying coupons then invested and wound up controlling huge chunks of companies. So rather than everybody being invested in the state, it was only a few who were investing because they had bought.
That was growth. That's what it
Yeah, the money and the power became concentrated in the hands of just a few people. And with the oligarchs, that's very true because they have massive amounts of capital under their control and they're super ridiculously rich. This is one of the things that Boris Yeltsin says when he steps down. So he does the same thing as Gorbachev, right? He goes on TV and reads his resignation for the nation, right? And he says, I want to ask your forgiveness that many of our dreams didn't come true, that what seemed to us to be simple turned out to be painfully difficult. I ask forgiveness for the fact that I didn't justify some of the hopes that of those people who believed that with one stroke, one burst, one sign, we could jump from the gray, stagnant, totalitarian past to a bright, rich, civilized future. I myself believed this. One burst was not enough, but I want you to know, I've never said this, today it's important for me to tell you, the pain of every one of you, I felt it in myself, in my heart, in saying farewell. I want to say to every one of you, be happy. You deserve happiness. You deserve happiness and peace. And again, that's not me saying that, that's Boris Yeltsin. Yeah, so kind of sad, right? Kind of sad that it seems that he tried very hard to accomplish what people wanted, and again, didn't quite get there. And in his defense, who knew how to do this, right? It had never been done before. Nobody had ever switched from a communist, socialist country into a democratic market economy. First time, right? So how do you do it? It's anybody's guess. And so, you know, maybe he didn't do the best job, but again, it's hard to know how these things will work. And again, economies are complicated and governments try to manage them, but sometimes, you know, when you do something, you're not really sure how it's going to pan out, right? There's always a bit of an X factor. And so, you know, it didn't really work out in the early years for Boris Yeltsin. Eventually, I think it will for Russians. Their quality of life will increase. But he just didn't do what I think people thought he would be able to do and what he thought he'd be able to do, right?
Did any other country do this after him?
Not as far as I'm aware. I think every communist country that became one remains communist, but they've tinkered with their communism a little bit. And China is probably the obvious example of a socialist economy, but they have pieces of a market economy running within it, right? So there's a lot of state planning and organization, but there's also market forces are being used as well. And that brings us to this guy. Vladimir. That guy looks better?
Yeah, and then the one in the book, like in the book, he looks like this.
Oh, original from.
He's a lot younger. He's a lot younger there because the picture you see of him in the book is probably
August
2002. So he's, well, I guess he's 50. He's 50 years old in that picture. Here he's probably older, to be honest. Maybe he's just in better light. As we'll find out, he's got an interesting backstory because he's a former KGB operative. And so the KGB was Russia's secret police during the Soviet Union. And so the KGB are the ones who were spying on citizens and, you know, enforcing, you know, making sure that the government wasn't questioned or threatened in any way. If you remember from V for Vendetta, you know those guys that had the badges? Basically, they're the KGB, if you will. And so, yeah. So Putin was one of these guys. until the end of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union collapses, there's no real need for his services anymore, and he has to find a new job, and he does. But we'll get to that. First, let's take a bit of a break, and then when we come back, we'll deal with Vladimir Putin. Okay. Okay, and we're back. So again, we've kind of arrived at the appearance of Vladimir Putin on the scene, right? And so he's again, he's going to take over for Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin in 1991 will kind of steal the Russian Republic right out from under Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev will have to resign because he has no unions in his republic, and Yeltsin will proceed down the path of trying to convert Russia's centrally planned socialist economy into a market economy. And as we've kind of very quickly skimmed over the surface, things don't go that well. A lot of people suffer, a lot of people are plunged into poverty, a lot of people who have really high hopes for what their standard of living is going to be like are disappointed because for a time their standard of living stays the same or probably gets worse before it gets better. And so Yeltsin faces a lot of opposition, a lot of criticism. As I say, he develops a drinking problem in the process, and then eventually he steps down at the end of 1999. And of course, someone else will have to come to power, and that someone else is this gentleman right here, Vladimir Putin. And so I don't know how much you know about Putin, but we're going to find out. We're going to find out some things about him.
Did Putin go from his name?
Nope, different thing. What's that? Uncle Vlad. I don't think anyone calls him that.
I don't think he'll call him Putin either.
No, I was making that up. Maybe Donald Trump calls him Pootie. I don't know. Okay. Huh? No. Right. So I have a video to show you. I have a short documentary to show you about kind of who this guy is, where he comes from, and how he comes to power. And the video is a Canadian production, kind of an investigative news program a number of years ago. Did a bit of a piece on him to try and figure out, kind of to answer the question, who is this guy? Who is he? Where does he come from? And what does he want? Right? That's kind of what the show wants to know, and that's what we want to know as well. And so maybe what we'll do is we'll watch the first 15 minutes of it. We'll watch 15 minutes of it, then we'll come back here and talk very briefly before we end class, and we'll pick it up tomorrow, okay? So for online people, I've just put the link to this video in Microsoft Teams, and so you can access it there. And so go and watch 15 minutes, come back after 15, and then we'll talk about what we've seen, okay? So I'm going to turn you loose to do that, and we'll see you in 15 minutes. Okay, so hopefully we're back, and as you can see, we've gotten a little bit of an idea about who this guy is. And so, who is he? What have we learned so far?
Russian KGB dude.
Yeah, so he's a Russian. He's ex-KGB. Who are the KGB?
Like
Secret police. And what do we learn about KGB operatives?
They were basically the Gestapo of the Russians.
Yeah, they're the Gestapo of the Russian communist state, right? They're trained to be tough. They're trained to work in secret. They're trained to be manipulative and, to sort of psychologically bend people to their will, right? They're spies, right? They're a secret police spy organization.
He went to at a very young age. I don't remember the age.
Yeah,
They said, come back.
yeah, he tried to enlist in the KGB when he was only 16, and they said, "Yeah, you're too young. Come back."
The thing about him was that all the photos they showed of him when he was a child, like his mother was holding him, then he grew a bit older, then 16 and all. That's his face. It didn't change at all.
Yeah, he's remained very. Yeah, he's definitely looked the same for most of his life, right? He hasn't really. It's depressing. What?
Puberty didn't hit him hard.
What's that?
Puberty didn't hit him.
He what?
Puberty didn't hit him.
Oh, puberty didn't hit him, or it hit him, or it hit him very early. Right? Either way, he seems to have been fully formed from a very young age, right? Right. So he's working in East Germany. He's a KGB agent. East Germany becomes united. The Soviet Union is out. The wall comes down. No job, right? So he heads back to St. Petersburg, and what position does he manage to find himself in? Deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. And what's he kind of doing there as deputy mayor? What's that? Maybe. He's protecting something. He's protecting his boss, right? So the mayor of St. Petersburg and his former law professor Anatoly Sobchak, right?
The money thing.
The what?
The money thing.
Yeah, what's bleh, sorry, I just gotta chill. What's going on with the money thing?
Like basically, they were supposed to get tons of supplies, but then they don't get all of it. They get like 4 of it, and people think that they're corrupt. They're corrupt.
Yeah, so the deputy mayor here winds up, Putin winds up being in control of a lot of money and access, right? And so if foreign companies want to set up an office in St. Petersburg, they need the approval of the mayor, right? They need the approval of the mayor's office, and Vladimir Putin is the one who gives the approval. I wonder if he got any benefit from that, right?
Funny, like whatever they were saying about Putin and how he did his stuff and how the supplies vanished, the money did as well.
What's that?
That was pretty familiar.
Familiar in what way?
Like back home, that's the same thing that happens. We had a natural disaster once. There was a flood.
Yeah.
Like cities, villages, they were completely underwater.
Mm-hmm.
Aid came from Germany, came from Kuwait, came from everywhere in the shape of like money, pumps to just dump the water out and everything. I remember a plane landing in the city of Abadan. It's one of the cities down south. It's close to the border. It landed there. Then it got a call from Tehran, get over here. The plane went there and no one ever heard from the pumps again.
Yeah.
How long?
How long? 2 years?
Yeah, and so that's an easy method of corruption, right? Is that you want to get some money out, you want to steal some money from the government, you get your friend to set up a company for food or whatever, or disaster relief. You're in the government, you give that company a bunch of money to provide supplies or food or whatever it might be, or construction, and then you just kind of never check back on it to see if they deliver. Right? You just
It's actually pretty funny. Back again in my country, we can go out in the street and say whatever you want about any country and burn their flags, except our Russian brothers and
and it's well, and it's, as you'll see, it's going to be the same with Putin, right? Is that there are things you will not be allowed to say, but we'll get to that. But yeah, so he's embezzling money is what he's doing, right? He's signing contracts and paying out money, but he's never seeing if the food comes in or whatever comes in, because it's not, because he's paid money to his friend who owns a company, who has basically filled out paperwork that he owns a company. There is no company. The company doesn't produce anything. It doesn't exist. It just exists on paper, right? But Vladimir Putin writes a check to this company, this imaginary company, and then doesn't really bother to see if the stuff gets done. And then you've just given your friend millions of dollars of government money, which I'm sure you get a piece of. So lots of money is going out the door that way. He's making deals with the mafia, apparently, the Russian mafia. He's making deals with foreign companies who are probably bribing him to set up offices in St. Petersburg. So he's got, as they say, he's got his fingers in a lot of different pies, as they sometimes say. I don't know why people would want to put their fingers in a pie, but that's just what the expression is.
I thought you were gonna say deal with the devil.
Well, yeah, but I think he's the devil in this case. I think he's the one with the power, and he's able to make deals because he has the money, right? He's the one who's signing the checks, and he has the ability to grant access. And there's nothing new about this in terms of the Soviet system, because in the Soviet system, because people were kind of all paid just what they needed, if you wanted more, the only way to get more was to sell influence, right? Or to sell privilege. So if you had access to something that no one else had access to, then what's it worth, right? What are you gonna give me to say yes to this, to give you access to the thing that I control? And so people kind of use their positions of power to gain money, right? So they're exchanging favors, or it's money for favors. It's corruption, right? And there's a lot of corruption in the Soviet system, and that transfers over to the Russian Republic. And it seems that in the early years, Vladimir Putin is very heavily involved in the process of, favors for money, or simply just embezzling money from the government, right? Sending money out to buy things that will never arrive, and then again he gets a cut of that cash. So some pretty sketchy stuff going on pretty much right from the very beginning, right? What's that? Well, and again, in a system where there's not a lot of oversight or regulation, this stuff can happen, right? So like here in a business like we have, there's lots of reconciling, right? So every day we're checking our bank statements to look at the money that went out, that we paid out for bills and things like that, and the things that we received. And everything's got to be reconciled every day. So there's no possibility that money is disappearing anywhere. We know where all our money is going.
They just had a revolution. Here in Canada, if you had a revolution today, who knows, maybe it takes a year or two before things get back under control.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, right? Is that the sort of regulations and procedures and rules and laws that you should have in place, they're not in place yet, because they're basically a brand new country. They were just born, right? And so they don't have the regulations to stop this or the rules to stop it. And like I mentioned, there already is this kind of there's a precedent of corruption, right? So the corruption in Russia doesn't start here, starts in the Soviet Union. And by the time we get to Russia, the Russian Federation, corruption is a way of life, right? Bribery is just how business gets done. I have bribed people in Russia because that's just how you get things done, right? And so I don't agree with it. It's not good. Don't turn your recorder on. This is live to the internet anyway. But it's true. That's just, it becomes a way of doing things, right? It's a way of doing business, right? You shake hands with people, you have coffee, and sometimes you pass them a little money to get things going, right? And it just becomes it's just a way of doing business, right? And again, what's that? Yeah, and it's not, and it's not, yeah, it's not limited to, it's not limited to Russia either, right? There's lots of countries in which that's just the way things work, and it's not the way things should work, but it's the way that things work, right? Okay, so that's all the time we have. I'm going to call it there. Come back tomorrow for our last class. Ah,
Sad.
I know, right? Come,
Miss you.
come back. No, you won't. Come back tomorrow for our last class, and we'll finish with Putin, and we'll try to tie things up, okay? So I'll see you tomorrow, everybody. Goodbye.